Hello and welcome to the Street Crime America's YouTube channel. Please don't forget to like, share, comment and subscribe. Today we look at the life of a notorious American criminal who will never be forgotten about in the American criminal underworld. Frank Costello, born Francesco Castiglia, born on January 26, 1891, was an Italian-American crime boss of the Luciano crime family. In 1957, Mr. Costello survived an assassination attempt ordered by Vito Genovese and carried out by Vincent Gigante. However, the altercation persuaded Mr. Costello to relinquish power to Mr. Genovese and retire. He eventually died on February 18, 1973. Mr. Costello was born on January 26, 1891 in Loropoli, a frazione of the town of Cassano allo Leone in the province of Cosenza, in the Calabria region of Italy. In 1895, Mr. Costello boarded a ship to the United States with his mother and his brother, Edward, to join their father, who had moved to New York City's East Harlem several years earlier and opened a small neighborhood Italian grocery store. While Mr. Costello was still a boy, his brother introduced him to gang activities. At 13, Mr. Costello had become a member of a local gang and started using the name Frankie. He committed petty crimes and went to jail for assault and robbery in 1908, 1912 and 1917. In 1918, he married Loretta Geigerman, a Jewish woman who was the sister of a close friend. That same year, Mr. Costello served 10 months in jail for carrying a concealed weapon. While working for the Marcello gang, Mr. Costello met Charlie Lucky Luciano, the Sicilian leader of Manhattan's Lower East Side gang. The two Italians immediately became friends and partners. Several older members of Luciano's family disapproved of this growing partnership. They were mostly old-school mafiosi who were unwilling to work with anyone who was not Italian. To Mr. Luciano's shock, they warned him against working with Mr. Costello, whom they called the Dirty Calabrian. Along with the Italian-American associates Vito Genovese and Tommy Three Finger Brown, and Jewish associates Meyer Langsy and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, the gang became involved in robbery, theft, extortion, gambling and narcotics. The gang went into bootlegging, backed by criminal financier Arnold the Brain Rothstein. The young Italian success let them make business deals with the leading Jewish and Irish criminals of the era, including Dutch Schultz, Oni the Killer, Madden and William Big Bill Dwyer. Mr. Rothstein became a mentor to Mr. Costello, Mr. Luciano, Mr. Langsy and Mr. Siegel, while they conducted bootlegging business with Bronx beer baron Mr. Schultz. In 1922, Mr. Costello, Mr. Luciano and their closest Italian associates joined the Sicilian crime family led by Joe the Boss Massiera, a top Italian underworld crime boss. By 1924, Mr. Costello had become a close associate of Hell's Kitchen Irish crime bosses Dwyer and Madden. Mr. Costello became involved in their rum-running operations known as the Combine. This might have prompted him to change his last name to the Irish Mr. Costello. In 1925, Mr. Costello became a U.S. citizen. On November the 19th, 1926, him and Mr. Dwyer were indicted on federal bootlegging charges. They were accused of bribing two U.S. Coast Guardsmen, presumably so that they would not disturb the unloading of liquor from boats in New York Harbor. The largest boat in the Combine fleet could carry 20,000 cases of liquor. In January 1927, the jury deadlocked on bootlegging charges from Mr. Dwyer and Mr. Costello. In 1926, Mr. Dwyer was convicted of bribing a Coast Guard official and sentenced to 2 years in jail. After Mr. Dwyer was imprisoned, Mr. Costello took over the Combine's operations with Mr. Madden. This caused friction between Mr. Madden and a top Mr. Dwyer lieutenant, Charles Vanny Higgins, who believed that he should have been running the Combine instead of Mr. Costello. Thus, the Manhattan Beer Wars began. At this time, Mr. Schultz, who was also having problems with gangsters Jack Legs Diamond and Vincent Mad Dog Cole, who had begun to rival Mr. Schultz and his partners with Mr. Higgins' help. Eventually, the Costello-Madden-Schultz alliance was destroyed by New York's underworld. In the late 1920s, Johnny Torrio helped to organize a loose cartel of East Coast bootleggers, the Big Seven, in which a number of prominent gangsters, including Mr. Costello, Mr. Luciano, Longies Willman, Joe Adonis and Meyer Langsy played a part. Mr. Torrio also supported creation of a national body that would prevent the sort of all-out turf wars between gangs that had broken out in Chicago and New York. Mr. Torrio's idea was well received and a conference was hosted in Atlantic City by Mr. Torrio, Mr. Langsy, Mr. Luciano and Mr. Costello in May 1929, and the National Crime Syndicate was created. In early 1931, the Castello Marise War broke out between Mr. Massiera and Salvatore Maranzano. In a secret deal with Mr. Maranzano, Mr. Luciano agreed to engineer the death of his boss, Mr. Maciera, in return for receiving Mr. Maciera's rackets and becoming Mr. Maranzano's second in command. On April the 15th, 1931, Mr. Luciano had lured Mr. Maciera into a meeting where he was murdered at a restaurant called Nuova Villa Tamoro on Coney Island. While they played cards, Mr. Luciano allegedly excused himself to the bathroom, with the gunmen reportedly being Mr. Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. CIRO, the Artichoke King, Terranova, drove the getaway car, but legend has it that he was too shaken up to drive away and had to be shoved out of the driver's seat by Siegel. In September 1931, Mr. Luciano and Mr. Genovese planned the murder of Mr. Maranzano. On September the 10th, 1931, when Mr. Maranzano summoned Mr. Luciano, Mr. Genovese and Mr. Costello to a meeting at his office, they knew Mr. Maranzano would kill them there. Instead, Mr. Luciano sent to Mr. Maranzano's office 4 Jewish gangsters whose faces were unknown to Mr. Maranzano's people. They had been secured with the aid of Mr. Lanksy and Mr. Siegel. After assassinating Mr. Maranzano, Mr. Luciano subsequently created the Commission to serve as the governing body for organised crime. In 1931, after the Mr. Maciera and Mr. Maranzano's murders, Mr. Luciano became the leader of the new Luciano crime family, with Mr. Genovese as underboss and Mr. Costello as consigliere. He controlled the slot machine and bookmaking operations for the family, with associate Philip Dandy Phil Costello. Mr. Costello placed approximately 25,000 slot machines in bars, restaurants, cafes, drugstores, gas stations and bus stops throughout New York. In 1934, Mayor Fiorello La Guardia confiscated thousands of Mr. Costello's slot machines, loaded them on a barge and dumped them into the river. Mr. Costello's next move was to accept Louisiana Governor Huey Long's proposal to put slot machines throughout Louisiana for 10% of the take. Mr. Costello made Mr. Castell overseer of the Louisiana slot operation. Mr. Castell had the assistance of New Orleans mafioso Carlos Littleman Marcello. Mr. Costello brought in millions of dollars in profit from slot machines and bookmaking to the Luciano family. In 1936, Mr. Luciano was convicted of running a prostitution ring and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in state prison. Mr. Luciano attempted to rule the crime family from prison with the help of Mr. Costello and Mr. Lanksy, but found it too difficult. With Mr. Luciano's imprisonment, Mr. Genovese became acting boss of the Luciano crime family. In 1937, Mr. Genovese was indicted for a 1934 murder and fled to Italy to avoid prosecution. From May 1950 to May 1951, the U.S. Senate conducted a large-scale investigation of organized crime, commonly known as the Kefauver hearings, chaired by Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee. Mr. Costello was convicted of contempt of the Senate and sentenced to 18 months in prison. Senator Kefauver concluded that politician Carmine DeSapio was assisting the activities of Mr. Costello, and that Mr. Costello had become influential in decisions made by the Tammany Hall Council. Carmine DeSapio admitted to having met Mr. Costello several times, but insisted that politics was never discussed. In 1952, the government began proceedings to strip Mr. Costello of his US citizenship, and Mr. Costello was indicted for tax evasion of $73,417 in income taxes between 1946 and 1949. Mr. Costello was sentenced to 5 years in prison and fined $20,000. In 1954, Mr. Costello appealed the conviction and was released on $50,000 bail. His confinement interrupted by periods when he was out on bail pending determination of appeals. In 1956, Mr. Adonis, a powerful Mr. Costello ally, chose deportation to Italy over a long prison sentence. Mr. Adonis' departure left Mr. Costello weakened, but Mr. Genovese still had to neutralize one more powerful Mr. Costello ally, Mr. Anastasia, who had taken over the Mangano crime family after the disappearance of boss Vincent Mangano and the murder of brother Philip Mangano on April 14, 1951. In early 1957, Mr. Genovese decided to move on Mr. Costello. Mr. Genovese ordered Vincent Gigante to murder Mr. Costello, and on May 2, 1957, Mr. Gigante shot and wounded Mr. Costello outside his apartment building. The altercation persuaded Mr. Costello to relinquish power to Mr. Genovese and subsequently retire. On October 25, 1957, Mr. Anastasia was murdered at the barbershop of the Park Sheraton Hotel at 56th Street and 7th Avenue in Manhattan. Carlo Gambino was expected to be proclaimed boss of Anastasia's family at the November 14, 1957 Appalachian meeting. Mr. Genovese called that to discuss the future of Cosa Nostra in light of his takeover. When police raided the meeting, to the detriment of Mr. Genovese's reputation, Mr. Gambino's appointment was postponed to a later meeting in New York City. In 1959, Mr. Genovese was convicted of selling a large quantity of heroin. On April the 17th, 1959, Mr. Genovese was sentenced to 15 years in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia. During his retirement, Mr. Costello was still known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld. He still retained power and influence in New York's Mafia and remained busy throughout his final years. Cosa Nostra bosses and old associates such as Mr. Gambino and Mr. Lachaise still paid visits to Mr. Costello at his Waldorf Astoria penthouse, seeking advice on important Mafia affairs. And Mr. Costello's old friend Mara Lanxey also kept in touch. Mr. Costello occupied himself with gardening and displayed some of his flowers at local horticultural shows. On February the 20th, 1961, the United States Supreme Court upheld a lower court order that stripped Mr. Costello of his US citizenship. But on February the 17th, 1964, the same court order set aside a deportation order for Mr. Costello, citing a legal technicality. In early February 1973, Mr. Costello suffered a heart attack at his Manhattan home and was rushed to Doctors Hospital in Manhattan, where he died on February the 18th. Mr. Costello's sedate memorial service at Manhattan Funeral Home was attended by 50 relatives, friends, and law enforcement agents. Mr. Costello is interred in a private mausoleum in St. Michael's Cemetery in East Elmhurst, Queens. In 1974, after Mr. Costello's enemy Carmine Galante was released from prison, Mr. Galante allegedly ordered the bombing of the doors to Mr. Costello's mausoleum. Mr. Costello has been portrayed in several movies, including by actors FEODOR CHALIAPIN Jr. in My Brother Anastasia 1973, James Androcchia in Gangster Wars 1981, Carmine CRADI in Bugsy 1991, Costas Mandylor in Mobsters 1991, and by Kirk Bolt in the television movie Kingfish, a story of Huey P.LONG 1995. Mr. Costello was referenced in the Allen Ginsberg poem Hadda Be Playing on the Jukebox. The line is written, "It had to be the FBI chief J. Edgar Hoover and Frank Costello, syndicate mouthpiece, meeting in Central Park, New York weekends," reported Time magazine. The poem was later performed live with music by the band Rage Against the Machine on the album Live and Rare. The film The Departed features an Irish mob boss named Frank Costello, who is played by Jack Nicholson in present-day Boston. Mr. Nicholson's character is not related to the real-life Mr. Costello except in name. The character was based on Boston mobster Whitey Bulger, with the film plot based on Infernal Affairs, a Hong Kong thriller made in 2002. Mr. Costello was portrayed by Anthony DiCarlo in AMC's docudrama series The Making of the Mob, New York. He was portrayed by Paul Sorvino in the 2019 television series Godfather of Harlem. So what are your thoughts on the crimes committed by Frank Costello? Please let us know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, stay safe.